So without further ado then, as I say, just please do share any comments or questions with us either on YouTube or through the Zoom webinar as we go through it. But I'm really delighted to welcome our first speaker, Professor Tamsin Ford from the University of Cambridge. So Tamsin is Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and her research focuses on the organisation, delivery and effectiveness of services and interventions for children and young people's mental health. So warm welcome to you, Tamsin. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Can I just check that everyone can see my slides? So if the rest of the panel can, that's good. So please don't feel you need to take notes. As Emily said, everything, including the references behind the research, will be available with a copy of my slides at the end of the webinar. And I'm going to talk, I hope, in a way that's reassuring. We're all in uncharted times. Our lives, for all of us, teachers, mental health practitioners, researchers, have completely changed. And that is anxiety provoking, but that the level of anxiety needs to be contained, because for most of us, it won't be a pathological level of anxiety. So I wanted first to highlight the fact that actually we know a lot, and a lot of you are doing amazing things in schools that support the social and emotional development of your pupils and their mental health. At the risk of teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, I would point you at the department, the Public Health England whole school approach document. It's referenced with a link to it in the references, and that highlights the things that schools can do to optimize the mental health of their students. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I'm going to pull out certain highlights. It was led by Public Health England, but also with the support of the Children and Young People's Mental Health Alliance, which is a broad coalition of third sector organisations working in this space. The other very useful piece of research that I'd like to point you at is a systematic review that I and colleagues from Exeter led in relation to behaviour. Now, sometimes people split off behaviour and feel that it's not really mental health, it's something different. I would argue against that. Behaviour is often a communication. And also children who struggle with their behaviour to the point that it causes problems for them, their family or their school, they have an increased risk of every mental health condition there is in adulthood. So difficult behaviour is something that's very toxic to children's development. This practitioner report, there's a short practitioner report because we know that teachers and other people working in schools are hugely busy, and then there's a much more detailed publication, both available on the Education Endowment Foundation's website, which gives you the science. And in fact, there were 3 linked systematic reviews where we systematically searched the literature. And the key recommendations are, you know your pupils. Make sure you try and understand their influences, and I'll explain that a bit more in a minute, because for some of them you'll have a very good idea of who your vulnerable pupils are, but there may be some people who've got some additional vulnerabilities. Teaching learning behaviours rather than purely focusing on discipline. The evidence base for supporting behaviour in schools is around the promotion of good behaviour. That's where there is evidence, and there is growing evidence. There is no evidence to support very discipline, punishment focused approaches. That's not to say that I'm saying there shouldn't be consequences for misbehaviour, but you will do better by your children if you focus on encouraging the positives. This doesn't need to be expensive. I'm in a minute going to talk about a particular training course, but there are lots of simple things that you can do. For those who struggle, you are going to need to be a bit more targeted, but actually it's more of the same. And consistency with individuals and across the school is absolutely essential. So coming back to the influences, behaviour is on a spectrum from more negative to more desirable, and the influences on children's behaviour and indeed their mental health can be both positive and negative, and those kind of interact. So where we hope most people is in this part of the diagram with lots of positive influences like social relationships and abilities to do things and integrated into clubs, and that hopefully will lead to good mental health and better behaviour. But things happen, life happens, and this epidemic's happened, and that's probably shoved most of us towards this corner with a few more negative influences, like maybe anxiety about catching the infection, maybe families have been directly affected by the infection, there may be worries about income, etc. So just being aware of the influences that your children in your school are struggling with is important. But I would urge schools, and this is broken down in more detail in the report, to focus on what you can manage directly. I think there is often a pressure on schools to take responsibility for absolutely everything. And whilst you might want to be aware of things like domestic violence, you have a legal duty to, or the way culture might not fit terribly well with the culture of the school, you can't be expected to change it, and you're certainly not responsible for it on your own. There are legal, statutory, safeguarding things you'd have to do, but we're not saying focus on that. Focus on relationships in the school, teacher-pupil, and re-establishing peer groups and being very careful of those who are socially isolated. Bullying is probably our most tractable public mental health risk factor. It casts a shadow over childhood mental health as well as adult mental health. These are the things that teachers can do. And then in the middle, there's a whole load of things that can have an influence that you might be able to do a little bit about, but it's not primarily your responsibility. I'm now going to talk about the approach to behaviour management in classrooms which has the most evidence. And this is what's called a logic model, which I'll break down for you from the trial we ran. So we tested as far as we could using schools in Devon as an experiment where half of them got the intervention and half of them didn't. This course for teachers. Teachers came along for one day, for 6 whole days, but at one day at a time, spread out by a month, groups of 10 at a time. The idea was it was collaborative. The teachers are the experts in their context, and it was taking them through ways to be proactive in their behaviour management rather than reactive, and to plan the behaviour management plans around children who struggled in a way that supported better behaviour in the classroom. So how did we think it worked? Well, I think one thing we were not surprised about, but we're delighted to see, is most of the teachers found it very validating. They said, we know this stuff, but it's kind of giving us permission to experiment. It's giving us time and space to think about what we're doing. But if you then have a teacher who's calmer, feeling more confident, has strategies around the more tricky customers that they're dealing with, for individual children will then feel more settled, they're having a better time at school, their efforts to behave are being recognised. That in a class level feeds into a calmer class where people can work and the teacher is less stressed, and you get into a virtuous cycle. But of course, all this bit down here, the government, Ofsted, what's going on in society, obviously the COVID pandemic and what we've all just been through and the fears about things opening up feeds into that. But ideally, if you get that going, you will have better mental health in the pupils, in the teachers, and better attainment, better attendance and fewer exclusions down the line. Rather than me banging on about this, I want you to hear from one of the teachers who took part in our study. Oh, I think it might. It's not going to play. I'm very sorry. It's worked on practices. Again, I can point you to a website where you can see her. But what she says is the course helps you to shift your mindset in that you start noticing and picking up on the positives where children are doing what you want and responding to that rather than picking up on the negatives. And the negatives then fade away because the children are clearer about what they're supposed to be doing, and they feel, you know, they're getting the response. What we need to remember is just how rewarding adult attention is, and negative attention, being told off for stuff, may not feel rewarding to the teacher who's having to do it, or the parent who's having to nag, but actually it is attention and it is rewarding. The next point I want to make is that actually most kids are going to be doing fine. So these are strengths and difficulties questionnaires results from young people, from parents, and from teachers, from a massive survey in 2007 and 2004. There were nearly 8,000 children involved in this survey. You'll see that this graph, so a higher score is bad, and how high you're scoring is along the bottom line. So the kids here are scoring very highly, and the blue arrows are where the clinical cut point is. And what you will see is they're not two groups, those who are coping and those who are not. It's what scientists call a normal distribution, like height or weight. Most of us are in the middle. A few are really thriving, and a few are not doing so well. And whether you come outside that clinical cut point will depend very much on your support network, your psychological makeup, and the school environment. But the point I wanted to make is that, you know, COVID might have shifted us all a bit further to the right, although results in adults on a survey where they had baseline data before COVID suggests there was a spike, and then actually it's come back to normal. And within that, there will be different groups that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But actually, we shouldn't assume that everybody is traumatized. We've had to adjust, but we're designed to do so, and most people are doing fine. The groups that I would recommend being worried about as teaching practitioners, or indeed mental health practitioners, those with pre-existing mental health conditions, because it says something about their current resilience, and also services that normally support those children, be they third sector or the CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services in the NHS, have had to move very rapidly to a different way of working. Now, for some people, actually, they're preferring it, but for other people, they may have experienced a drop in the support that they need. So be aware of who your vulnerable children are. Those who tend to be anxious or tend to get very sad, this might have been enough to tip them into a clinical episode. And school, sadly, can be a serious source of anxiety for some children. And we need to remember that for some children who struggle in school, either because academically it's tough, or because they're anxious, socially anxious, or anxious about separation, two common reasons, they might actually have found it better at home. And quite often they struggle to get back into school after, say, half term or the summer holidays. They will have had a long time at home, and they may really struggle to get back in after such a break. And they probably will need, some of them, some really careful thinking about how you break down the steps. Some of the children in our population will have had COVID-related adverse experiences. It's worthwhile noting that actually the infection, we know more in adults because more adults have got very poorly with this, but the infections in adult may have some direct effects on the brain. But also, if you've had to go into intensive care, it's a very unpleasant experience. And a study of children who were in intensive care for meningitis showed that most of them had post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards. There may be families under severe financial strain, and children may have been bereaved. The other group are those with special educational needs, who you will know all about because you know, you will have a register and you'll have plans in place. I think one group I'd particularly highlight are those with autism spectrum condition, for whom change and transitions are really, really hard. They will have found it very hard to cope in lockdown, and they will find it hard to come back into school, particularly as it's not only the transition, but the school they come back to will be different. Very last slide. This is from a study of children who are actually on their way to being excluded And so the complex journey was how they coped at school coming up to that time. But I think actually we're all on a coping continuum, aren't we? We all cope better sometimes than we do other times. And just to say, whilst the home situation will impact on children's ability to cope, so does school. There is lots that schools can do to help. And it's about a positive ethos and knowing who might be struggling and knowing how much, knowing what you could put in to support the children who need a little bit of extra care. And that comes back to the original Public Health England report, but also the Know Your Pupils and Their Influences. And the final comment is, there are some children who are going to struggle anyway. Educationally or mental health, these children will need additional help. The vast majority of the school population will do just fine. And in between, there is this red vulnerable group. And that's where the strategies you put in health can make the difference, whether they end up back in the white group or the orange group. I'll stop there because we want time for questions and I don't want to run on. Thank you for your attention.